Before we begin with the more complicated aspects of the post-production of this tutorial, I wanted to take a moment to go over my kind of behind-the-scenes workflow here, how I work with files, and how I've included files for you to follow along and learn this on your own. Now, in order for you to get the most out of this tutorial, we've chosen to include all the files from all of the photo shoots that we're going to be editing in Photoshop with your downloaded content. Now, while we were putting together this tutorial, we ran into a little problem when we decided that we wanted to include all the raw files. It turns out that in giving you guys hundreds of raw files, the tutorial would have been absolutely massive. The raw files were anywhere from 25 to 50 megabytes a piece, sometimes even more. So what we're doing is giving you high-resolution JPEGs. Now we've come up with a system where I'm going to show you what I've done to get the files to the point that they're at using Lightroom. Now some of you guys might use Aperture or Capture One, but I'm using Lightroom. And then from there we've exported the JPEG so you can follow along exactly with what we've got in Photoshop. So again, I'll do some basic processing in Lightroom, and then from that point I've given you those processed JPEGs, which together we're going to take those files, bring them into Photoshop, and make our final images. So I want you to have a basic overview of how this works. I'm going to be using two programs here. I'm going to give you a quick little intro about how I use Lightroom, and then we're going to really jump into detail on how I use Photoshop. So in front of me now I've got my Lightroom open. As you can see, I have all the lessons from this tutorial laid out in folders. Now within each of those folders are specific lessons from each location. For example, this is us in Hawaii at the Lava House, and before I start working on this in Photoshop, there's a lot that I might do to it. I might adjust the exposure, for example. I might pull up the shadows or the highlights to get the most data out of the file. There really isn't too much that I'm doing in Lightroom. I might do a little bit of white balance adjustment, just some general raw adjustments before I take it into Photoshop. Again, the bulk of this tutorial is going to be in Photoshop. I do like Lightroom for organizing and exporting files, and maybe after we do Photoshop, we'll save it back into Lightroom. But for now, I just want you to understand I'm going to do some very light file prep in Lightroom before I export those JPEGs to you and into Photoshop so that together we can walk through each of these files. Now with any raw file, you could actually start editing with Camera Raw in Photoshop and keep everything contained to Photoshop. But the reason I love Lightroom is that it's great for culling, it's great for rating, it's great for doing general raw adjustments and keeping everything organized and in one place. So when I'm working on my own, I like to jump back and forth between Lightroom and Photoshop. But like I said, I'm going to try to keep this simple and easy to follow. So I'm going to do some light adjustments, some organization, then we're going to export to JPEG, and together we'll work on those files in Photoshop. Now keep in mind that if I was working by myself, not teaching anything, and just doing a regular assignment, I would open my raw files right from Lightroom into Photoshop. But again, because we wanted to give you the same files that I was working on, I've exported these to JPEG for you to better be able to follow along. There is an option here to right-click, edit in, open in Adobe Photoshop, but again, like I said, I'm going to be putting these in JPEG form, so everyone, no matter what platform or what program, what operating system, how old or how new it is, we all have an equal starting point and everyone can learn the same things. So that was just a brief discussion about Lightroom, and we'll touch more on that throughout the tutorial. But now that I've kind of gone over that, let's talk about how this is going to work. I want to show you the folder and file structure of all these lessons so you can easily open up the JPEG files and follow along in Photoshop. I'm going to minimize Lightroom here, and this is just an example. Again, if you've downloaded this and you're watching the video, you've probably seen all these files. I want to show you, if you're going to click into one of these lessons, for example, this is just an arbitrary number here, but for this lesson, lesson 08, and this is in your downloaded folder, I'm going to double click and open this up, and within each lesson there is the video that plays describing the lesson and all of the information within, and next to that there should be a folder called Photos, and within that folder I've gone ahead and labeled and numbered each of the shots that we're going to use in our final composited Photoshopped image. In order to open these up in Photoshop in a way that makes sense, I'll show you how to do that right now. I'm going to go ahead, open up Photoshop, I'm going to go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and I click on that. Once you have this dialog box open, you're going to hit Browse, and you're going to open the folder containing each of the photos within the downloaded tutorial lesson. I hit Open, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 here. I have all of my files numbered and named. I click Open. I make sure everything is unchecked. I don't want Photoshop thinking for me at this stage. I hit OK, in Photoshop will take a second and it will automatically load these files into a layer stack. As you can see, everything is loaded in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, and is perfectly aligned, ready to go. Now there are many ways to get these images into Photoshop in a layer stack, but for the sake of simplicity and keeping it consistent, we're going to do this for every single lesson in this tutorial. Now one thing you may notice is that it's always going to load these files with 1 at the top and 4 at the bottom. So I've gone ahead and labeled and numbered appropriately so that the base image or the starting point for every image is at the bottom, and then it goes in reverse order ascending towards the top. It'll make a lot more sense when you jump into this. It's not too complicated, but I just wanted to point it out so nobody's confused. Now that we have these images loaded into Photoshop, I'm going to take a minute to show you how my Photoshop is set up so that you can best follow along. Now, depending on the version and operating system, things might look a little bit different, but it will be helpful to have at least some similar settings so we can work together and keep everyone on the same page. The first thing I'm going to do is very simple. I'm going to go to the Window button up here, and I'm going to uncheck this Application Frame button. What unchecking this Application Frame button does is it allows you to easily shuffle documents around in Photoshop without having them attach or tab on to other documents. To me, it just helps keep things cleaner, and again, I don't like when Photoshop thinks for me and tries to snap documents to different parts of the screen. I like to keep things free-flowing and simple. It is a matter of preference, but I do find that's the best way to do it. After we have the application frame turned off, I'm going to go to Photoshop, and then we're going to go to Preferences in General. This might be different on Windows. I'm on a Mac. You can hit Apple or Control-K to open your Preferences pane. And once that dialog box is open, I'm going to go to Workspace, and I'm going to uncheck Open Documents as tabs, and I'm going to uncheck Enable Floating Document Window Docking. Again, that just keeps it easier for us to move our documents around in Photoshop without having Photoshop snap things to various windows or edges. So that's it for the Preferences panel. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Edit, Toolbar, and there's a couple things here that I want to make sure you have in your Photoshop before we start. This might not apply to older versions, but if you're on Photoshop CC like I am, you want to make sure that your tools match, so when I say, let's get the paintbrush, it's there. You don't have to go looking around for it. What we have here is the Customize Toolbar window. On the left-hand side, you'll see all the tools that are available in Photoshop. Now, everything here is also going to show up over here. So you want to make sure that we have the same tools on this left-hand side toolbar. Everything on the right that's grayed out will not show up when you're using Photoshop. So what you want to do is if you don't see any of these tools, you want to drag it over from the right-hand side to the left. So for example, this elliptical marquee tool, if it's on the right-hand side, I want you to drag it over to the left, and I want you to do the same for all of these tools. Most of these tools are already going to be set up on the left-hand side, but just double check and make sure that you have the most important ones. Those are going to be the Move tool, the Polygonal Lasso tool, the Crop tool, the Healing Brush tool, the Brush tool, the Color Replacement tool, the Clone Stamp tool, the Gradient and Paint buckets, and lastly, the Pen tool. Once you have all those in place, you can go ahead and click Done, and that will ensure that all of these tools show up in your toolbar when you need them. Now that we have Photoshop actually set up, let's take a few minutes and go over the most important functions and concepts in Photoshop that I'm going to use over and over again. The first thing I want to talk about is the concept of layers in Photoshop. This is what makes Photoshop Photoshop and what makes it much different than Lightroom. In Lightroom, you can only work on a single file at a time, but in Photoshop, we can open as many as we want and stack them on top of one another. This will allow us to erase and reveal and hide and alter different versions of the same photo, or in some cases, if you're doing complex compositing, different photos together to meld them into one. As you can see here, I have 4 layers, a sky, interior, a lighter and a darker base layer, and using Photoshop, I can turn these on and off and they will all stay aligned. And again, I can hide and reveal certain parts of each layer to show what's underneath to make a better final image. In order to do that hiding and revealing, I'm going to use what Photoshop calls a mask. What this is essentially a non-destructive way to erase and reveal one layer to show or hide what's above or below it. So by adding a mask to one layer, I can again erase some of that upper layer and show what's on the layer beneath it. In Photoshop, there are many kinds of masks and many ways to make them. The most basic way is to come down here and click on this Add Layer Mask button. If I click this Add Layer Mask button with my first layer selected, what's going to happen is I'm going to get this white box with a little rectangle around it. That means that mask is selected. So now that we've added our mask to this layer, I'm going to show you how to hide and reveal that. The most simple way is using the paint bucket. If I select the paint bucket, which is over here, I can click G or select the paint bucket tool, and I fill this mask with black, what's going to happen is it's going to hide this layer and reveal the one below. So I'm going to go ahead and dump that with black, and as you can see, the layer below is revealed. Now this is obviously a shot that was taken much later where all you see is the interior glow of these lights. Now if I switch my colors, my foreground and background color to white, and I paint bucket again, that mask again shows the original layer, and we did not hide it because we're using a white paint bucket. Now let me show you how powerful this really is. I'm going to go ahead and fill this with black again, and I'm going to go select the paintbrush, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start painting in and revealing some of that original layer. Right now it's all hidden, but if I take this brush and I start brushing in the sky, you can start to see how we can blend time between two exposures. Now these two shots were taken on a tripod, maybe about a half an hour apart, and as you can see, I'm blending in that much darker later shot with the much brighter earlier sky. And this is obviously a very crude example, but you can start to see how powerful these tools are. Now, obviously, I don't want to be that heavy-handed with it, and there are many ways to refine our mask to get much better results. The first way is using the lasso tool. That is L. Right here, I prefer the polygonal lasso tool because in architecture, we're mostly working with straight lines, and what that will allow me to do is, for example, I can zoom in and trace the edge of this house using the lasso tool. I'm just going to do this really quickly so you get the idea. I can make almost a perfect trace. And then what I'm going to do is once I close this, I can now select the paintbrush, and I can hide or reveal, but it will be constrained within that lasso area. So, for example, if I want to use this shot, but I want to brighten the interior a little bit, I can just kind of make this quick selection around the house, and using a black brush, I can reveal some of those brighter lights inside. And again, this is a little bit heavy-handed and quick and dirty, but it shows you the power of masking. In addition to the brush and the paint bucket, I also like to use the pen tool a lot. That is P for the shortcut for the pen tool. The pen tool is similar to the lasso, but it gives you a lot more flexibility, and we'll get into that throughout the tutorial as well. Now, lastly, there are various ways to create masks, and again, we're going to get into that using channels and luminosity and all kinds of different things, but that's another lesson for another time. In the interest of moving it along, the last thing I want to talk about here is changing the blend mode. And this is over here, right in the layers palette. Now, what the blend mode does is the blend mode affects how one layer interacts with another. Right now, these are set to normal, and it's almost as if we have literally two solid images on top of each other. If I change the blend mode from, say, normal to lighten, what happens is I'm only letting the lighter part of one image show through another. So I'm changing the blend mode. I can change it to screen, I can change it to lighten, and again, you can see the difference that this makes. What's happening is we're actually seeing all of the lighter parts of the image above this darker, later image being kind of filtered out so that all that Photoshop shows us is the lighter sky against the darker interior of the house. There are tons of blend modes, and we'll get through many of them in this tutorial, but again, it's just something I want you to be aware of and something that we're definitely going to investigate further. The last thing I want to talk about are adjustment layers, as some layers are actual image files, other layers are actual filters or adjustment layers that we can put on top of those image files to change their appearance. For example, if I come down here and click Create New Fill or Adjustment Layer, I can add, for example, a curves layer. And using that curves layer, I can adjust the exposure of everything underneath it. Another thing that I can do is a hue and saturation layer, which will allow me to change the saturation, the hue, the luminosity, etc. of the layer below it, or multiple layers below it if you're so inclined. Now, many of you may have used similar tools to this before. A lot of them are located in the Image Adjustments tab up here, but the problem with these is that they're destructive, and once you make that edit, you can't really undo it. When you're using these adjustment layers, they come with a built-in mask, so again, you can paint in or paint out some of that adjustment layer accordingly so it only shows in certain parts of the image. extremely useful for working on a file non-destructively. Now, most of this stuff we're going to cover in much greater detail, but I wanted to just give you a quick overview of how we're going to use Photoshop and Lightroom to put together these files. So now that I've talked about our post-production process a little bit, let's get out in the field and start making some photos.